Welcome, everybody, to Ask Trinity Archives. I'm Joe Lipinski.
And I'm Marissa Maggs.
And we are two archivists working in the archives at Trinity Church Wall Street. This year, Rising Ground is commemorating the 190th anniversary of the opening of the Leake Watts Orphan House, the institution that would eventually evolve into the Rising Ground that continues to thrive and support New York's children, adults, and families today.
The connection between Trinity Church Wall Street and Rising Ground goes much further back than this year's joint discussion series. In fact, it goes all the way back 190 years to the opening of the Leake Watts Orphan House, that very date that we are excited to be celebrating now.
John Watts Jr. was one of 7 children born to John Watts Sr., a wealthy Scottish immigrant, and Anne Delancey of New York's founding Delancey family. Watts Jr. went on to be appointed Royal Recorder of New York, an administrative colonial post, but a colonial post nonetheless. I stress this fact because sources point to Watts Jr. being a patriot, and as his career flourished and was elected to the New York State Assembly in 1791 and later to the United States Congress in 1793, Watts Jr. became the only government official in New York to serve both the English crown and later hold state and federal offices after the American Revolution.
In 1793, the only child of Watts Jr.'s younger sister, Margaret Watts Leake, died at the age of 8. The boy was the planned heir of his childless paternal uncle, John George Leake, who was also a close friend and brother-in-law of Watts Jr. It was decided that Watts Jr.'s son, Robert, would become Leake's heir instead, provided he took Leake's surname. In his will, Leake had stated that any heir must take the last name Leake, otherwise the money was to go towards the founding of an orphanage, quote, to foster, educate, and protect orphans. Robert never had the opportunity to change his last name, so the executors followed John Leake's wishes and founded the Leake Watts Orphan House, one of the first private charitable institutions dedicated to child welfare.
The original site of the orphanage was in Lower Manhattan, and although we're unsure of where exactly, it was likely on Trinity land. And in 1843, the orphanage moved uptown to 112th Street in Amsterdam, a location which was eventually sold and would become the future location of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The orphan house was moved again to a spacious farm in Yonkers, where Rising Ground maintains a presence to this day.
The legacy of Leake Watts lives on today through the work both Trinity and Rising Ground continue to do, providing services to those in need. From adoption and fostering services, domestic violence and social services, and always adapting to provide care for those who need it most, whether it be children suffering from HIV/AIDS in the 80s or focusing on the education of preschoolers with autism today, Trinity Church is proud to be partnering with Rising Ground and their 190-year history of caring for New Yorkers.